Kia ora everybody, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, e raurangatira, ma tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Vicky Plater toko ingoa, he manutaku aho o Te Tai Ohanga. Kia ora, welcome everybody to the latest in Te Tai Ohanga, the Treasury's Wellbeing Report seminar series. My name is Vicky Plater. I'm a director here at the Treasury. Amongst the areas of my responsibility include climate change, labour market, education and skills issues. So I am very delighted today to be able to welcome Ilan Noy for our seminar series today. And as I was just saying to Ilan, I've not seen a piece of work before that actually brings together the human capital dimensions associated with climate change and natural hazards. Tend to see it more thinking about environmental or financial or economic perspectives, but not human capital. So I think this is really interesting work. So let me introduce Ilan to you. Ilan is the chair in the economics of disasters and climate change, Te Āwhionukurangi at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. His research and teaching focus is on economic aspects of natural hazards, disasters and climate change and related topics in environmental, developmental and international economics. He is also the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Economics of Disasters and Climate Change. Ilan previously worked for the University of Hawaii and he consults with the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and has with the OECD, UNDRR, the IMF and ASEAN. So it is a great joy to be able to have Ilan working on these really important issues. So I just, as we get started, I just encourage you, please feel free to put any comments or questions in the chat. The intention is that Ilan will speak for about an hour and then I will navigate through the questions that are in the chat so that we can have some Q&A for the remaining time. And with that, I would like to pass across to Ilan. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, ko Ilan Noy tōku ingoa. Kei te Āwhionukurangi aho I mai ana. No Israel aho. Shalom, bruchim aba'im. Toda shebatem. Thank you very much, Vicky, for the kind introduction. This is my fourth time giving a talk at Treasury, so I'm grateful that somebody is still willing to listen. I do promise that this is all of this is based on new work that we've been doing in the last few months, so this is not going to be a repetition of my previous talks at Treasury, except maybe a little 5-minute interlude at some point. This is largely based on work that I've been doing with the World Bank and especially with Inés de Marcos, but several other people are involved, including Germán Caruso and a few others. We are working on, well, the impact of climate change on human capital. So that's the topic of my my talk today. So let's start with sort of just for fun presentation of climate change. This is the date in which the cherry blossoms in the main temple in Kyoto every year, and you see that in the last few years it has been blossoming earlier and earlier. So we clearly see one footprint of climate change in this type of data. So last year, the date was March 26. This year, it was March 27. So these are all very, very early dates, so very clear imprint of anthropogenic climate change. Of course, there are 1,000 others, similar graphs that you can show for various other phenomena that climate change is causing. What we focus here today is on the way climate change has an impact on human capital. So just to define what I mean by climate change and human capital, climate change is the anthropogenic change in the intensity of heat waves, of floods, of other extreme weather events, sea level rise, and other ecosystem changes that are anthropogenic in nature, so being caused by the greenhouse gases that we've put in the atmosphere in the last 150 years or so. By human capital, we refer to the knowledge, the skills, and the health accumulate throughout our lives that enable us to realize our productive potential. So what I'm focusing in this talk is the way that climate change has an impact on human capital. There is also, we could look at the way human capital has an impact on climate change, but this is not the focus of today's talk, because what we're trying to identify, I think, in this well-being series is what are some of the risks to well-being, specifically in Aotearoa. So what do we do in this? Framework I'm proposing today? We think that, well, there is climate change, and climate change has an impact on human capital through 3 different ways. Climate change leads to direct impacts on the economy, on the environment, and those impacts have an impact on human capital. But because of those impacts, we also have 2 responses, and those responses are the mitigation efforts, which we'll define in a minute, and the adaptation efforts, and both of these also have an impact on human capital. So we are not only looking at the direct impact of climate change on human capital, but also the way mitigation and adaptation have an impact on human capital. So if we, broadly speaking, this is the framework we're interested in. Climate change at the top. So climate change can be increased temperatures, increased average temperatures, increased extreme temperatures, the increase in frequency and intensity of weather events, sea level rise, and other environmental impacts. And then it works through these 3 channels: mitigation, impacts, and adaptation. The way those have an impact on human capital is through two possible channels. One is directly on health, nutrition, and well-being. On well-being, you can think about it in the way we use it as mental health. And then the other channel is through its impact on economic systems and infrastructure. And those economic systems and markets and infrastructure have in themselves impact on human capital. Okay, and then we can differentiate between the impact of those impacts of climate change during the life cycle. So there would be a different impact, for example, in the early stage of life, in utero to 5 years, to maybe 60 and above, so the elderly. Okay, and we are trying to identify separately the impacts of mitigation impacts and adaptation, separately through health and nutrition and economic system, and separately through each stage in the life cycle. Okay, now human capital, the impact on human capital can be an impact on the accumulation of human capital, but it also can be so on our ability to accumulate human capital. So, for example, to accumulate knowledge through education. Or it can also have an impact on our ability to use the human capital that we already have, to use it productively, or to protect the human capital that we already have from being diminished. So for example, for our health to deteriorate, or for our knowledge to become irrelevant. Okay, so just to stick with the definitions, impacts we refer to the direct consequences of the interaction of anthropogenic climate change with human and natural systems. Mitigation is the human interventions whose aim is to reduce the amount of GHGs, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And adaptation is the adjustments that we make, the policy adjustments that we make. Well, it could be policy, it could be just households adjusting to the actual, or maybe even to the anticipated changes in the climate. Okay, so we are differentiating between direct impact, mitigation, and adaptation. Just a little bit about sort of a cautionary note here. I'm employing an economics lens because, alas, I'm an economist, and I apologize for that. But in economics, the way we think of economic research, we generally think of three types of research. Formal theory. Formal theory largely is not very interesting with respect to climate change, or hasn't been up to now, because the theory is pretty straightforward. All we need to do is increase the price of carbon, and then we can do mitigation, and everything will be great. So all we need to do is an ETS that encompasses everything, or some kind of a tax on carbon. The empirical causal analysis, that is the sort of the second stream of economic research, is largely based on existing data, and existing data, of course, only refers to the present and the past and not the future. And a lot of the concerns we have about climate change is in the future, although not all, and we'll get to that. Or structural modeling, and that has been the main tool that we have looked at, that economists have looked at climate change up to now. But I think there is a lot of parameterizations, a lot of quantities that are missing in this structural modeling, and because of that, I think up to now at least, the structural modeling of climate change has largely been, but to be polite, useless. There are some limits in the way that economists have looked at this, and to some extent those criticisms apply to what I'm going to describe here. So what we do in this project, we are looking at all these, so every one of these little boxes essentially describes to you one either impact mitigation or adaptation of climate change, one stage in the life cycle, and through those two various channels. In each one of those boxes, we're trying to assess the degree of intensity of the effect that we describe, and the degree of amount of reliability of the evidence that we have. Okay. Now, I'm colorblind, but at least my co-authors are not. And what I think you can see is that the colors at the top seems to be more intense than the colors at the bottom. We know more about the early stages of life than we know about the later stages of life, which is the bottom rows. Why do we know less about that? Largely because it's easier to do economic research on the early ones. So again, this does not necessarily mean that there is less impact, but just that we are given the constraints of the economic tools that we use, that I just described. That's what we know, and I can talk a bit more about that later. Okay, so in terms of impact, the main impact that we can identify with the current tools that we have in economics is the impact of extreme weather events. And when I talk about extreme weather events, of course, geophysical risk and extraterrestrial risks are not related to climate change at all. But a lot of the impacts that we know, that we can identify, given the economic tools that we have, we can more cleanly identify them, for example, for earthquakes. And because these are, from an economic perspective, these are very similar phenomena to, say, a big flood or a big hurricane or typhoon, we think that the lessons we learn from looking at earthquakes are also applicable to the extreme events that we do associate with climate change. So to some extent, I'm also going to mention things like earthquakes, even though they're not related to climate change. Okay, but the other four are clearly related to climate change: hydrological, meteorological, climatological, and biological disasters are related to climate change. Of course, we know a lot less about the links between biological disasters and climate change. So just to give you an example, there has been a hypothesis that COVID-19, the emergence of COVID-19, is to some extent related to climate change because ecosystems are being constrained. There's more wild animal and human interactions, and because of that, that zoonotic jump from wild animal to humans that was made probably in Wuhan at some point in 2019 became more likely because of climate change. There are other sort of stories around biological risks that might be increasing with climate change, but we know a lot less about that. So this is not something we can easily quantify, and I'm going to ignore them. But I am going to look at other types of events like flood, storms, and droughts. In terms of what we think climate change is doing to those types of events, when it's shifting, this is an example for precipitation, for rainfall. It's shifting the curve to the right. There is, generally speaking, going to be more rain globally because of climate change, but the main impact is going to be in the tails, the main impact in terms of what matters to us. And you can think about it either as events becoming more intense, which is basically the horizontal part of the shift, or events becoming more frequent, and that's the vertical part of the shift, but it's the same shift to the curve. So when we're trying to differentiate whether the events are becoming more intense or more frequent, that actually is the same phenomenon. Okay, so I'm not going to sort of really pay attention to that distinction here. Okay, just to give you an example of what we can know about the impact of climate change on extreme weather events, this is from another piece of research that we've done on Hurricane Harvey in the city of Houston. I'm not sure if you at home or in the office or wherever you are can see the slide clearly, but what we can identify basically is the flooding part that happened in the city of Houston in 2017 that is related to climate change. So there would have been flooding anyway, but there was additional flooding because of climate change. The details here don't matter, but we can identify actually for each building in the city of Houston how much of the flooding that they experience is because of climate change. What we show in this piece of research that extra flooding is associated with some kind of an ethnic bias, in a sense, towards Latinx-owned properties or Hispanic. This is not the topic of my talk, but I'm just showing that's one way to think about the extreme events and climate change, and that's what we want to do here. Just another sort of aside. This is a sort of an assessment of globally of what is happening to extreme weather events because of climate change, and the numbers there basically is by how much is the probability of those events occurring is changing because of climate change. So if you look at, for example, heat waves, or at least the heat waves for which we have done those calculations, are becoming 77% more likely because of climate change. Okay. Now the range is different in different locations and in different types of heat waves. So some heat waves are, that's the point there, the one there at the top. Those events are heat waves that would not have been possible, or would have been, as the climate scientists call it, virtually impossible without climate change. But some other types of heat events maybe are only 20% more likely because of climate change. And you can see the range of changes in the frequency, in the likelihood of these events is different across different types of events. Okay, and you can look there at the bottom right. Cold events are not surprisingly becoming less likely because of climate change. Okay, of course, we used to call it global warming rather than climate change, so it seems obvious that cold events are less likely in most locations. Again, some locations potentially may have a different impact. Okay, so from that piece of research, we can show, if we're interested in, and this is sort of the last, I think, slide before I actually delve into the human capital aspect, that the annual cost of climate change in terms of extreme weather events, we calculate it to be $150 billion. That's not a trifling sum, I think, even if when you sit at the Treasury. If we think about it, the last conference of the parties, the last COP in Glasgow, the whole discussion was about how do we make sure that we spend $100 billion a year on both adaptation and mitigation, but here we already argue that the cost of climate change, just in terms of extreme weather events, is already $150 billion a year. So clearly, our numbers don't add up in terms of how much we're willing to spend on this problem. Okay, so what I want to do from now on is basically talk separately about impacts, about mitigation, and about adaptation, and delve in a little bit about what we find in terms of the impacts on human capital. So here you can see the impacts, the direct impacts channel through which climate change has an impact on human capital. You can see that basically those impacts can be experienced across the life cycle, where most of the vulnerability is at early ages and at the later stages of life, although we have less evidence on the later stages of life. And those impacts can be manifest both directly through physical, mental health, and nutrition, but also through impacts on markets and infrastructure. Okay. Okay, when we talk about impacts, typically of any extreme events, and here in terms of climate change, we are talking mostly still on the impact of extreme weather events. There are other aspects of climate change. We frequently talk about sea level rise. I think largely we talk about sea level rise because of Al Gore and the photogenic pictures that he has done of Manhattan being flooded by 6 meters of water. Not because this is where the big risk is. The big risk is in the extreme weather events, and they're changing frequency and intensity, or at least for now. Of course, I hope to be not to be proven wrong, but of course, if the sea levels suddenly go up by 2 meters in the next 50 years, then we are going to have a big problem. But what I'm focused here is on extreme weather events. Extreme weather events, the risk from extreme weather events is the hazard itself. So that may be the storm or the extra precipitation or the extra heat wave or whatever it is. That's the hazard, but that hazard has to meet an exposed population which is vulnerable to it. Okay, so we know, for example, I'm sitting here in Wellington. We know that we are not very vulnerable to wind because we have a lot of it, so we are used to it. In other locations, the same wind strength, the same hazard that we experience here on almost a daily basis would potentially hit a very vulnerable, say, housing stock and can cause a lot of destruction. Okay, so you need both the exposure, so the people and infrastructure and so on to be there, and you need them to be vulnerable in order for the hazard to actually turn into a damaging event. Okay, and what we can then think about is at different stages of the life cycle, vulnerability is different. Exposure is probably pretty similar because we live in societies which we have people across the life cycle around us, but vulnerability is potentially very different. Okay, and specifically the vulnerability to impacts is very high at the in utero and the early childhood stages. So we know, and I'm sure you know that what they call the first 100 days of life are very important. Of course, first 1,000 days of life are very important. The 1,000 is just an arbitrary round number, but we know the earlier it is, the more important it is. So the exposure in utero and in infancy, vulnerability is very high to malnutrition, and there's a lot of evidence on that, including malnutrition at the in utero stage. So if mom is malnourished, there is significant implications for the embryo in terms of its future development all the way up to adulthood. So we can measure the impact of malnutrition at in utero on adults. There's extra vulnerability to infectious diseases, for example, cholera and things like that. Stress, we know that stress is also associated with adverse outcomes, even already exposure in utero to stress. So that has implications. And here I'm talking about stress caused by, say, an extreme weather event or a hurricane or whatever it is, or a drought. We know that extreme temperatures are also very important at the early stages of life. So extreme temperatures at the early stages of life, again, have long-term implications for human development, and contaminations. Again, even in utero, contaminations can have long-term implications in terms of measured at adulthood. So measured at educational attainment, measure at potentially salaries. So that's another sort of proxy for skill levels. We do know that these are there's very high vulnerability at these stages. So there's a lot of evidence on this, a lot of evidence because it's really simple to establish the causality here. Because all you have to do is compare cohorts that are born with the exposure to, say, an extreme weather event or to an extreme, let's say, a pandemic, and compare those to cohorts that were born just before that, just after that, or just near that, to be able to identify the impacts on these long-term impact. So just because we can identify clearly, we know how to quantify this, and we have plenty of quantification. So just if you think about pandemics, and we all think about pandemics, unfortunately, in the last 3 years, we have a lot of evidence that those people who were exposed to the what used to be called the Spanish influenza epidemic in 1918 and to 1920, there's long-term implications to human development for those cohorts that were in utero during that time. Okay, we have evidence from both, because the evidence is pretty easy to establish. We have evidence from both lower income countries, from higher income countries. But we do know that to some extent those vulnerabilities are higher in low income disadvantaged communities. So that could be communities in low income countries, in high income countries, doesn't matter. But the more disadvantaged the community is, the more impact there is from climate change during in utero and early childhood. Another aspect that we haven't really been aware of until recently is the issue of epigenetics. So epigenetics is essentially the idea that those disadvantages that are caused by exposure potentially in utero or at early childhood can be transmitted to future generations through changes in the genetic makeup of individuals. So we used to think about nature and nurture and how these are two completely separate phenomena. And either you're affected by nature, or meaning your genes, or nurture. But actually, we realize now that that distinction is not that straightforward, because nurture can also affect nature, because can also affect your genes. So to put it differently, trauma, and we're talking here about trauma, say an exposure to we have examples of earthquakes, but we have examples of other types of trauma, of hurricanes, of whatever it is, of a big flood. Trauma can be heritable to the next generation. So we know, for example, that people whose grandmother was exposed to trauma have a different genetic makeup because of that exposure to the trauma. Okay, so this is not passed through nurture, but through nature. So it's and now there is some science around this, and we know that genes are not genes. And here I'm sort of moving away a bit from my comfort zone because I'm not a genetic scientist. But there's something about the way genes are expressed that can be affected by the environment. So it's not necessarily that the genes themselves are being changed, but rather the way they are being expressed in affecting us. Something around a process called DNA methylation, which is about some kind of a methyl cover to the genes that does or does not turn them on, and that is potentially affected by exposure to, for example, trauma. So if a trauma is caused by an environmental shock that is caused by climate change, that can have multiple impacts for multiple generations. Now, if it has adverse impacts for multiple generations, then of course the impact is much bigger. Okay, so we are underestimating when we think that the impact is only for those people who have been directly exposed to that event. Even if they've been exposed to in utero, it actually progresses to future generations. And there is some very interesting research on that from various places. Okay, school-age children. We know that the main impacts for school-age children, and we know that has a lot of impact on human capital, is through nutrition. High temperatures are not only related to nutrition, but also related to the ability to concentrate in school, for example. So with high temperatures, we know, for example, that kids' educational performance in testing, for example, in the PISA test, for example, you can show which day the student took the PISA test, and if they took it on a hot day, then they performed worse. So if we have consistent high temperatures, especially again, vulnerability is higher in poorer, more disadvantaged communities when there is, for example, no air conditioning, then performance in educational and educational attainment will be lower. There's also destroyed infrastructure. So if these extreme weather events are destroying roads or destroying schools, of course, there will be an impact on human capital. And there is also these extreme weather events are affecting the budgets of households, and therefore they will reduce their spending on education and health. We know from a lot of research that when a household's budget is becoming constrained because, for example, it could be an earthquake or a hurricane or whatever it is, you typically do not cut spending on nutrition, but you cut these things that are, in a sense, easier to cut, like, first of all, luxuries, but then expenditure on education and health, and only at the end you cut nutrition if you don't have a choice. So we know, and again, there's a lot of evidence for that on this reduction in the spending on education because of these big shocks. Now, in terms of the adults and the elderly, less evidence, but there is some evidence on declining health because of climate shocks. There is some evidence on lower productivity with high temperatures. So we know that workers are less productive in periods of higher temperature. And we also know that some of those, if there is a big shock, there might be some people lose their job, and who loses their job first is typically those people who are older. So in a lot of cases, that would mean that they cannot be retrained again or cannot find it difficult to find a job again. So it induces early retirements. So these kind of shocks can also induce early retirements. Again, that's a loss of human capital. Okay. Of course, impacts can also include early mortality. Again, obviously a loss of human capital. Inequities, at the risk of sounding Marxist, and actually Marx is a relative of mine. He's the sort of a uncle of a great grandparent or something like that. Yes, the inequities here are very stark throughout both high-income countries, low-income countries. Those impacts are, you need vulnerability, and the vulnerability is much higher in more disadvantaged communities. Okay, there's a lot of evidence on that, and that's true in Aotearoa, and that's true in Bangladesh, and that's true in basically everywhere. Okay, in terms of mitigation. So again, to remind you, the mitigation is the effort to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So mitigation actions can be things like changing the mix of energy that we produce or use, changing transportation methods to those that are more friendly to emissions, or less friendly to emissions, and things like that. Okay, what do we have evidence on that? So mitigation also has an impact on human capital. It's less of a concern than the direct impacts of climate change, but still we can identify some channels. Again, we don't have that much evidence on it, so the evidence base is weaker. It's also weaker because a lot of it is prospective rather than has already happened. A lot of the mitigation transition that we're talking about hasn't happened yet. So this is much more speculative, and given the economic tools and given the fact that economists hate speculation, well, at least when it's not comfortable for them, then we have less research on this. Okay, but overall, I need to make sure that this is clearly understood. Mitigation there's a lot of benefits to mitigation, a lot of co-benefits to mitigation, and a lot of benefits potentially to various aspects of human capital. But what we are trying to identify here is the way that mitigation also poses a risk to human capital. So that's not an argument for, not doing mitigation, not reducing the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We just need to worry about also the negative impacts that it has on climate change. And to some extent, that has been something that hasn't been thought much about. To me, there is a clear analog here between what we have done with mitigation, what we are doing now with mitigation, what we had previously done with globalization, where we know that there's a lot of benefits to globalization, to increasing, specifically, I'm talking about increasing trade. So all economists, there's a wide support for that. That's the one policy area where economists have sort of agree almost universally on it, that increased trade is good. But our theory says that some segments of society may be harmed by trade, and we sort of tended to discount that. And only in the past 10 years or so, we've realized, 10 to 15 years, we've realized that that actually is a big issue, and that there are these communities that are harmed by trade, and we haven't worried about them enough, and a lot that has led to a lot of adverse consequences globally. And I think you can all think of, I don't know, the orange clown you had in the White House for a while, or other people like that, where to some extent that's a result of globalization. Okay, so in terms of mitigation, where are the risks from mitigation? On children, there's substantial health benefits from mitigation. So there's less coal-emitted pollution. So for example, we know that coal is by far the worst greenhouse producer of coal, generating energy from coal, generating, for example, electricity from coal is by far the worst in terms of greenhouse gases, but it's also by far the worst in terms of other co-emitted emitted pollution that is harmful, like particulate 0.5 particulates or whatever it is. So if we reduce coal, we are getting a lot of these other co-benefits for health benefits for children. Urban transport is similarly, the more we move out of our car and we start to use other methods of transportation, the more health benefits we will see. So there's a lot of benefits in terms of health, therefore human capital, from mitigation. The adverse impact is in those children who grow up in households whose income might be affected adversely by the transition. Okay, so for example, in places where there is a dependence on carbon producing industries, there might be a negative impact on households, and because of that negative impact on children, on their nutrition, potentially on other aspects of their well-being, and because of that negative impacts on human capital. Okay, there might also be an indirect impact through the higher costs of fossil fuels, and in some places, for example, that might mean increases in the price of various things, potentially food, certain foodstuffs that will become more pricey, and because of that, again, we might have an indirect impact through nutrition. So there are risks in terms of mitigation, and we need to identify them, and we need to counter them with policy. Okay. In terms of the risks in mitigation on the adults and the elderly, the main risk is job losses. So again, job losses in those and lower wages in some industries, which are becoming less attractive because they are associated with a lot of greenhouse gas emission. Okay, so it could be the industries that are directly producing the fossil fuels, but it could also be under in other types of industries. So mechanics that work on petrol cars that there's going to be a lower demand and therefore low wages for their services in the years to come. Okay, and so there will be also changes in relative prices across products, and again, those changes in relative prices pose implications for job losses and lower wages. That again, it's the analog to globalization is clear. We knew for decades that globalization will mean a change in relative prices and will mean to job losses in some industries. I think mitigation is not any different. That has implications for human capital, especially because it leads to early retirements of those people who are employed in those industries potentially. So it's mainly hit those people at the later stage of their career. So we have extra vulnerability there versus people who are earlier in their career and can easily retrain. But even those who can potentially retrain, so the 20 and 30-year-olds, there's costs associated with this retraining. We typically we know from globalization that episode of retraining also entails a loss of income. So people typically, the trajectory of income is increasing, but then they need to retrain to a different industry. They start from a much lower level and then start going up again. So that has implications to human capital. Again, it's a relatively small group. For most people, mitigation is going to be beneficial, and there's going to be a lot of opportunities in terms of new sectors and so forth. But there is this group that is losing, and we need to recognize that. And I think if I allow Mafalda to speak again, we need to recognize that, and we need to be more responsible with that than we have been with globalization, and more responsive to those risks, to those groups who are being harmed by mitigation, specifically from this human capital lens. In terms of adaptation, with adaptation, what we mean is we mean the responses of, again, I'm reminding you, we mean the responses of governments and households to the risks of climate change. So this is to risks that are already happening or to prospective risks in the future. So the prototypical adaptation program we can think of is a managed retreat program. So if we have a managed retreat program, that potentially has implications for human capital. Okay, so the channels through which we identified that adaptation will have an impact on human capital. One sector we can look at is agriculture. Agriculture will need to adapt. There's no question about it. So some crops are not going to be tenable in some locations, and there will have to be a different combination of crops that we grow anywhere in the world, but that also includes New Zealand. We lose a lot of human sort of this learning by doing that we have acquired over decades or maybe even centuries in how to do agriculture in specific locations and what crops grow and so on. We are losing that knowledge because the environment is changing. So we will need new types of crops, and we need to develop the knowledge for that. That's a pretty straightforward impact of adaptation on human capital. There potentially is some issue around demographics, although I think that's less relevant for Aotearoa. It might mean more to places where the decisions around fertility are dictated a lot by budget constraints and things like that. I don't think that's that big of an issue here. And then we have the issue of migrations. So these can be domestic, internal migrations or external migrations, can be managed or unmanaged. And we have the issue of insurance that I want to briefly talk about. I'm not going to talk more about agriculture and demographic changes because I think these are straightforward and I'll need to talk about them. I do want to talk about migration. So we know, and there's a lot of evidence on that there's both benefits and costs to migrations. Both internal migration and external migrations. We have a lot of evidence that people's income goes up when they migrate, even when they are forced to migrate. So, for example, we have interesting work on Hurricane Katrina in the US, which pushed a lot of people out of New Orleans unwillingly. But we do have evidence that their job prospects improved as a result of that. So their long-term income has increased because they were pushed out of New Orleans. That does not necessarily mean that their well-being has increased, but at least their income has. Okay, but equally, we know that there is a lot of costs associated with migrations. We know, for example, that migrations typically, especially international migrants, when they are forced to migrate, or even when they're not forced to migrate, there is an underuse of their human capital when in their new location. So, I grew up in Israel. We had a big migration of doctors in the 1990s from Russia. At one point in the hospitals in Israel, everybody who worked in the hospital was a doctor, including the cleaning staff, including the nurses. Everybody was a doctor because everybody was a Russian doctor, actually. So we have a lot of, this is just an example, but we have a lot of evidence here as well of that. So there are costs associated with migrations. We know that there are more costs associated with unplanned migration. So it is better if those migrations are done in a more preemptive way and managed. Okay, and this is both domestically in a sort of in a local program of, say, managed retreat. And managed retreat has been on the news this week with the National Adaptation Plan coming out. But we do, even for the managed retreat in a wealthy country like Aotearoa, we have some evidence that shows that there are costs associated with those managed retreats. So we know that we have one big example of managed retreat in here, and that's the Christchurch earthquake, the red zone in Christchurch, which moved 8,000 households to other locations. We have evidence that that had adverse income consequences for those households that were part of this red zone. Oddly, for reasons we don't entirely understand, it had only negative impacts on women, okay, and not on men. Why? I don't know, to be honest, but we do have this evidence. So even in a I think a well-planned managed retreat program like the red zone in Christchurch, we have adverse consequences to income, and those adverse consequences to income inevitably, not inevitably, but may lead to adverse impacts on human capital. Okay, there's other issues around around migration, for if it's an unplanned migration, especially, but also potentially managed. There might be stress associated with that. There might be other, even PTSD type impacts that has clear implications for human capital. Okay, so that's about migration. About insurance, well, insurance is not really an adaptation. It's an adaptation policy for the individuals because it redistributes this individual idiosyncratic risk to others, but it doesn't really reduce the risk at all. Insurance is not about reducing risk, it's about redistributing the risk. So in that sense, it's not an adaptation from sort of a macro treasury perspective. But insurance, I think, is important, because we sometimes misperceive it as a solution to these problems, but it just redistributes the risk. But also because insurance is changing as a result of climate change, and those changes in the insurance sector can potentially have an impact on households and therefore on human capital. Just to give you an example, if we look at, again, this is an example from an earthquake, but I don't think it's any different for other types of events. We know from the earthquake in Christchurch that in the first couple of years after the earthquake, when CERA, at the time, the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority was running its Wellbeing survey, the first 2 years, the response was, my main concern is the earthquake damages and the aftershocks. Within about 2 years, the main concern of most households that were surveyed was no longer the earthquake impact and the aftershocks, but my ability to deal with insurance. and the insurance issues around the earthquake. So clear implications on stress, and therefore also clear implications on human capital, because we know that stress is related to well-being. Okay, so we have a changing insurance system. Private insurance is largely, slowly, in some cases fast, retreating from this issue of climate change, and because insurance is about the unpredictable, not about the predictable, and because of that, we have more public insurance involvement in this space. And there are talks in New Zealand also of extending the reach of public insurance. And those programs, public-private insurance schemes, have an implications for household well-being and therefore also on human capital. Okay, and here I think, and maybe Christchurch is a good example, even though from many dimensions the Christchurch insurance cover was very successful, it also, in some sense, was damaging to human capital because of this alleviated stress and the prolonged time it took to settle claims and all the resulting problems associated with that. Okay, so we need to make insurance. We need to make sure that insurance, that the adaptation that we take in terms of changing our insurance systems is commensurate with this idea of making sure that its impact on human well-being its adverse impact is minimized. Okay, and that it is beneficial and protects and redistribute the risks the way it is supposed to. I do want to reiterate again that in general, the economic case for mitigation and adaptation is very, very, very clear. So I'm not trying to argue that we should be careful about mitigation and adaptation. I'm just trying to argue that we should carefully think about the impacts of those programs or mitigation and adaptation program on human capital, and we need not to repeat the mistakes of the past, and make sure that those are geared towards minimizing those adverse consequences to human capital. In terms of policy, there are several sort of suggestions here. Investing in disaster risk management, because a lot of the impact on climate change is through changing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, we need to invest more and more in disaster risk management. To some extent, we have been doing this in New Zealand. So we started with the National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA. We started with that a couple of years ago. We are spending more on disaster risk management. I think we need to spend more than what we are. We need to worry more about the early warning systems. We just starting an early warning system. Discussions around earthquakes and tsunamis haven't really gone that much further there. We need to make sure that our delivery systems for health and education are very resilient and robust to those kind of shocks, so we don't have the vulnerable falling through the cracks and not getting the services that they need because of shocks. And I think if you want to identify an area where that has been the case, you can think of COVID-19 and psychological services and as a clear example of where our health system has not been resilient enough, and we haven't been able to deliver the kind of services that we have normally expected to be delivered because of the shock of COVID-19. And I don't think that it would have been any different if there's been other types of shocks. So our systems of delivery are not resilient enough to withstand those shocks. We need to worry about contingent social protection policies that make sure that all the adverse events that we have, adverse possibilities that we have identified are people are protected from them through contingent social protection programs. Okay, so if we know that managed retreat potentially has an impact on incomes, then we need to make sure that we have contingent programs in place that account for that. Okay, including I want to highlight here the adverse effects of mitigation. Mitigation will have adverse effects on some groups. Those groups are not very large, and we could design safety nets to accommodate that. Okay. I think unlike the globalization, where the adverse effects, the groups that suffered are much larger than what we will experience in mitigation. So in some case, this is an easier case to make and an easier policy to embark on. We also need to sort of have an international perspective, because largely I think the biggest risk for us here in Aotearoa from climate change is actually the international one. So the way that international changes will have an impact on our country. And we need to consider those, including the impacts on human capital elsewhere and how we can alleviate that. Not only in sort of the Pacific Islands, which are we clearly view as part of us, but elsewhere as well. Okay. So in a sense, what I'm saying is we need to mainstream the considerations of these human capital effects in our climate change policies in general, but also in specific things like the public insurance schemes that we are now considering here changing because of climate risks. Okay. There is the other channel of impact as well, the other direction. So better human capital will enable better adaptation and mitigation policies. That is an obvious statement. Hasn't been the focus of this talk, but that does not mean that it's not true, and we shouldn't be thinking about that. So we do need to think about, for example, in terms of education, how we make sure that education is geared so that mitigation and adaptation are going to be done in the most efficient and rapid way that we can. We need to invest in reskilling and things like that. I think that's it from me. I'm happy to take questions. I think I sort of took an hour, which is about the time I was expecting to. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Ilan. Just trying to get my camera to come back on. There we go. That was such a wonderful exposition of some of the different channels by which climate change will impact on human capital. And I guess one of the things that really came through for me is there's different channels, but it also definitely seems to be exacerbating implications for different groups from climate change. There's some questions already appearing in the chat, so I'll encourage you to keep putting your questions in the chat, and I'll start working through some of them to pass them on to Ilan to answer. So to begin, Robert has commented that part of the reason the impacts of globalisation were more adverse than expected is because labour markets are more sticky than economists like to think. Yeah. In theory, people will leave failing towns and industries and benefit from newly flourishing ones. But in reality, people are often reluctant to leave their family, friends, and the industry they know. How can we overcome this inertia when it comes to climate change mitigation to ensure people aren't left behind? I think those issues are related to adaptation and managed retreat as well, but Robert has specifically asked about mentioned mitigation. Ilan.
Yeah, so yes, people are reluctant to move, but that if we have a lens of well-being, that might, we know that, for example, social capital and communities are really important for well-being. So it's not only about income. So even if their income prospects are better elsewhere, they may have very good reasons to be reluctant to move if their networks, if there's communities and so on are in location. So it's not about convincing people to move. It might be bringing the jobs to them and bringing the opportunities to them rather than assuming, okay, people will relocate as the need arises. Because people don't relocate, and sometimes, one view of that reluctance to relocate is because they actually have benefits from location that we can't measure, so social capital and so forth. There's also, we know that people are sort of status quo biased and are sort of, we know that there are these behavioral issues around people are reluctant to change, and sometimes when you push them to change, they actually end up changing and being happy with it. So here the assessment might be in the particulars, exactly what community we're talking about. Why are people not moving? Can we, is it better to convince them to move, or is it, or somehow lead them to move? In some cases, we need managed retreat. So in some cases, we need them to. And there we need to make sure that, for example, the managed retreat programs are done in a way that minimizes the social capital costs of that move. So potentially offer communities to move, the opportunity to move together if they so desire, and so forth. So I think the issue here is the particulars, but yes, I generally agree with the statement.
Thanks, Ilan. Chris Nees is, well, he has a couple of questions, but the first one is sort of single events versus accumulation. So in particular, he says, in terms of assessing the adverse effects from impacts events, are the studies measuring the effects of just a single event or a combination of them? So as an example, would you expect to see many of those impacts from the Ashburton floods of May last year or this year?
Yeah, there isn't much research on sort of the accumulation of impacts from repeated events. It's more difficult to do this research. So that's, again, I'm referring to that slide that says we are constrained by our tools to look at specific things. And we do know that these events have adverse impacts, potentially long-lasting. We have evidence of that from Aotearoa, from other wealthy countries, from poor countries, from wherever. We don't have much evidence on sort of is the repeated accumulation of events worse than sort of, if you think of two events happening, say West Point, two floods in the space of 2 years, is that worse than just having separately two floods? So is the accumulation in itself a worse, sort of exacerbating factor? We don't really know that, and that is a question that repeats itself. For example, in terms of droughts and farms resilience, droughts are going to become more frequent. But what do we know about sort of 3 droughts in a row? What does that have in implications for farmers and balance sheets and so forth, and therefore also to farm household income, and therefore also to human capital? I don't think we know enough to really say anything definite here.
Thanks. Chris's next question also picks up on a question I had thinking about the distributional effects in different places when you bring in the human capital kind of transmission. So Chris has specifically said, can you talk a bit more about if or how you would see the impacts differing in New Zealand compared with global averages?
The impact on
New Zealand, if you think about the climate change consequences for human capital in New Zealand relative to in other countries.
I'm not sure, actually. I don't think I can make a general statement here, and I think we need to think of each one of those boxes in the sort of in the. I can quickly find those. Yeah, these kind of tables, and we need to think of each one of those boxes and think, okay, is New Zealand less or more vulnerable than say other countries? Let's say Australia, or we like to compare ourselves to the UK for some reason. Are we less or more vulnerable? I think we do know, for example, that we are to some extent less successful in protecting the young in disadvantaged communities. So maybe there we have extra vulnerability, but I think the details here really matter, and I don't think we can have a general statement on New Zealand. We need to isolate each one of those boxes and think carefully about how does New Zealand stack up against other countries.
Thanks. And also in certain regions or subzones, I mean, you mentioned vulnerability of particular groups. If I think about areas that are more likely to flood, then obviously it will vary even more when you get down to smaller regions. Tom has said, you mentioned the negative effects of stress on human capital, including in Christchurch post-earthquake. How could this apply, for example, if future insurance, or when the future insurance cover becomes uncertain? And has this type of impact been quantified? What kind of metrics could be used to incorporate that dimension of uncertainty and stress?
So clearly, when you don't have insurance, there's more stress than if you do have insurance. So I'm not arguing. When I said that insurance was a cause for stress in Christchurch, I'm definitely not arguing that we would have been better off without insurance. But just to clarify. Insurance is becoming more uncertain, although to a large extent we don't have an insurance retreat yet in New Zealand. And my guess is that if we start to have insurance retreat, we will find a public solution to that. I actually don't doubt that we will. But there's clearly stress level issues around stress associated with lack of insurance cover or with the imperfect insurance settlement mechanisms that we have in place in Christchurch after the earthquake. We can measure that in a way CIRA did through surveys, but we can also measure that in other ways. If you're interested in doing research, then we can actually use the IDI, the integrated data infrastructure that Stat New Zealand so graciously supplies to researchers, and look at the use of psychological services, for example, as a result of extreme weather events that are imperfectly covered by insurance. Again, we don't really have that much of an example in New Zealand of lack of cover for insurance, because up to now insurance has been available, but that is definitely changing.
Thanks. It's also making me think, Ilan, of some of the work around the importance of mental health and mental health vulnerabilities in New Zealand. And again, the kind of accumulation of factors can keep pointing towards some of the same issues and their importance. I'm going to turn to a question Matt DeBoer has asked. Making good climate policy needs approaches that cross traditional risk silos. Climate risk assessments need to bring together different risks, including risks on natural and built environments, as well as on human capital. Can you please comment on any opportunities for methods to compare risks, impacts, and values that may be otherwise incommensurable?
I think I need a clarification for that. I'm not exactly sure what is the. This is clearly a complicated issue that needs inputs from a lot of ways of thought and disciplines and approaches. There is no silver bullet here, and not one tool can provide the solution. That's definitely not what I'm trying to suggest. I don't think there is. Again, it's sort of exactly which problem are we trying to address will determine the mixture of tools we need to use. Not sure I have more insight than that.
Matt, I invite you, if you have any follow-up, to feel free to drop it in. I'm going to take Chair's advantage for a moment, as I get to. I was interested in the policy perspectives that you put up towards the end, including thinking about social protection policies to offset adverse impacts, social safety nets, You mentioned public insurance policies. The one I was particularly interested in understanding better was your comment about adaptation policies internationally. I was wondering, does that relate in part to the migration dimension, or are there other aspects of international adaptation policies that you are thinking about there?
And a lot of it has to do with migration, both managed and unmanaged. But and specifically with the Pacific context, we can think of managed migrations that have to do with climate change risks. But not only. Okay, so if we think of one other type of adaptation, which I mentioned, is agriculture, and the fact that agricultural production is going to change globally. The pattern of which crops are grown where and so on is going to change globally. That has implications on us for what will be our position in the global market for agricultural products. So that implies that we need to think about that when we are trying to design our adaptation policies in agriculture. We don't need only to focus on what kind of crops we can grow here with the different changing climate that we are already experiencing and will continue to experience, but rather the demand side for our crops will be impacted by the way the rest of the world adapts to their changes. So we are part of a global community. So each one of those adaptation programs that we are doing will be also implemented elsewhere and will have an impact on the way we need to respond.
Thanks for clarifying. I'll turn to Christy's question now. Ilan, are the climate change implications for human capital different to the implications for physical capital from, say, a macroeconomic perspective? I'm assuming macroeconomic, Christy. The main distinction between capital and human capital seems to be that human capital cannot be appropriated. Is there some other difference between the two that I should also be thinking about in this context?
Well, first of all, it's much longer lasting. So especially if, and this is a bit more speculative, but if these epigenetic impacts are significant, and we know that they exist, but how much of a concern they are, we don't really know that yet. We know that they exist, and we know that the genetic research has shown that, but what is their implications on human capital, say 2-3 generations onward? We don't think of these long-term impacts of physical capital damages. So I think that is another distinction that is worth mentioning. And there is also not only the epigenetic channel. We also know that, for example, the most important determinant for the education of a child is how well educated their parents are. So if we have adverse impacts on education, those are lasting through several percolate through several generations, because if one generation loses, and we know, for example, that this generation, the one that experienced COVID-19, lost some education. This is also true in Aotearoa. It's even more true in the Philippines, where schools have been closed for 2.5 years now. But it's even true here, and we see that at the university where I teach. That has implications potentially for the next generation as well. So we do have these longer term issues around human capital that we don't have with physical capital. We also have the issues around, and we mentioned that a little bit about, the reluctance of people to move. So the adjustments in human capital are not as market oriented and not driven by incentives as clearly as changes in physical capital, which are driven by investors and spending and investment in infrastructure and so forth. So we can target incentives and design incentives much easier for physical capital recovery than we can for human capital recovery because of all these behavioral quirks of humanity.
I'm going to turn to Mark's question next and then go back to Bettina's, because I think it perhaps relates a bit more to that one that you were just talking about. What evidence is there that psychological services were unable to cope with demand during peak COVID-19, and what lessons are there from that if we are thinking about climate change?
So this is not my area of research, although I've started a little bit of research using the IDI to look at psychological services, but I don't really have any insights from there. This is a comment that basically is based on sort of media reports and actually personal experiences that I'm aware of some failures in the mental health system. And this is actually true globally. It's not, there are reports about that in the UK, in Israel, in the US, everywhere almost. There is an overload on the mental health system because of the heavy burden because of COVID-19. So I don't think it's actually not a terribly controversial statement to say that our mental health system hasn't coped sufficiently with this. What was the second part of the question, which I'm...
are there any lessons from this if we're thinking about the climate change implications?
That's not my area of, it's not my area of research. I wouldn't presume to know that. No, sorry.
Thanks, Ilan. So Bettina's question is turning back to insurance. Do you have a view on when and where these kinds of risks should be socialised? For example, where government should take the risk or make insurance in some way compulsory via taxation of some sort?
So first of all, I think there's more need to socialize the risk when it is borne by households rather than when it is borne by corporates or firms and so on, because for most households, the house is by far their biggest asset. A lot of time it's worth more than the overall net wealth. If we want to prevent sort of poverty and destitution, then there is a role for public intervention in insurance markets if the private insurance markets are not providing insurance. So there's a much stronger case for coverage of residential housing, and of course we see that in New Zealand, where the EQC used to also cover commercial property, but sort of stopped doing that in 1993. I think based on this idea. Now there are other issues around, how predictable the risk was. Is it predictable now? Was it predictable when people bought the property? So there are limits to the responsibility of the social of government to cover risks of which people were aware of and knowingly decided to expose themselves to. Okay. Now, where exactly those lists, where that border exactly lies, I think that is a matter for, I think, of politics more than sort of economics. We know that generally speaking, when there is a big event, the government is always happy to step in because politically it's much more expedient to step in than it is not to. So we also need to consider the political sort of drivers and realize that if we don't have explicit insurance, we will have implicit insurance through ad hoc interventions after an event, because the political motivation is very, very clear to me. And we've seen that in a few instances. If you think about the floods in Edgecombe some years back, where the government thought that a lot of people will be uninsured, and therefore the government stepped in very quickly and said, don't worry, we will also cover the uninsured. It turned out, fortunately, that there were very few people who were uninsured, but the government was very quick off the mark. This was the previous government. And so I think that we need to be aware of that, which argues, and it's much better to have explicit insurance schemes rather than these ad hoc implicit insistence after the fact, because then you can make sure that sort of the right people pay for it. It could be taxpayers, ratepayers, whatever it is. But then I think it's better to have those programs being explicit. So I think the border where the government's role starts is not that difficult to determine. And we can think globally, we can see where it is in many instances. I don't know if this was a precise enough response, but yeah, I'm happy to be blunter if there is a need, but I'm usually too blunt. Not blunt enough.
I think that was helpful in setting out at least the broad parameters that you see. If anyone has any last burning questions, I encourage you to put them in the chat now, because otherwise you'll have to put up with more of mine. And we only have a few minutes left. But Matt de Boer has kindly taken me up on his offer to try and clarify his earlier question, which was around climate risk assessments. He said he's thinking about ways to understand and quantify different risks to prioritise adaptation interventions. So, for example, the balance between improving resilience versus reducing exposure. So I guess I'd take that further and say, do you have a sense about how you might be able to think about prioritising across different adaptation interventions based on this book?
I think quantifications are important. So, you know, the standard way economists approach this is to quantify dollar value and also attach dollar value to various types of costs, including those that are not market-based. So we can think of, you know, value of statistical life and things like that economists use a lot. We can potentially quantify quite a lot. I'm not terribly fond of that because a lot of times that hides various ethical preconceptions that are sometimes problematic or are too hidden and are not made explicit. There are potentially other ways to do this. So I proposed some years ago an index called life years to measure, to be able to aggregate different types of impacts rather than using dollars. Some advantages to that. But even that is not good enough when you're trying to also compare other types of, you know, impacts on the environment, for example. How do you, I think here there's a bunch of value judgments that we need to reach, and those can be reached through consultations, through you know, discussions with communities and seeing what people prioritize. And I think people prioritize differently in different locations and in different cultures and so forth. So I don't think there is a sort of a one way to do that.
Thanks, Ilan. My last question for you is, based on this work, thinking about natural hazards and climate change and the impact on human capital, are there any particular areas of work that you think you or others are worth exploring further to tease into this more, or to think about the different transmission mechanisms?
I think a lot, actually. So, you know, if you think of the table I started with, which would take me like 5 minutes to scroll back to. Yeah, but anyway, I think I can reach that table, actually. Here. Every place that there is not very dark blue needs to be worked on, because I think in all of them there are things we don't know. Okay, I already mentioned, for example, the epigenetic channel. I think that's a major concern, potentially. If those epigenetic transmission mechanisms are strong, and potentially they are, then that means sort of an order of magnitude change in the impacts of adverse events in general. And we need to quantify that. So, because without quantification, without measurement, we are bound to mismanage. Each one of them, I think the elderly are especially a group that we've not researched enough. And now we're talking about 60 plus here. That is our sort of just arbitrary threshold. But people have the average life expectancy at the age of 60 is probably around 30 years, another 30 years. That's a very long time, and that's a lot of well-being that needs to. We need to make sure that we can provide the best well-being that we can, and that hasn't received in economics hasn't received attention. Part of it because of the constraints of our economic tools. So we know how to measure exposure in utero because that's basically your location of your birth. We know where you were. We don't really know where you are during those years of life, so it's much more difficult to identify and therefore much more difficult to do research. But that doesn't imply that necessarily those impacts are less. So we need to spend more effort on developing tools that will enable us to deal with those issues we can't look at with the current tool set we have.
Thank you so much. Sounds like we have plenty of work to do. And just that epigenetics that so plays into the intergenerational dimensions of well-being as well, which is really important. And I was also just struck by the phrase you just used, without measurement, we'll mismanage. So again, areas for lots of further work. Let me just bring this to conclusion. I want to thank everybody online for joining us today, for participating and for all your questions. But I particularly want to thank Ilan for presenting this work to us. I think you've really kind of prompted us to think about different dimensions that we may have not thought about before. I am sure that many of us will want to keep continuing these conversations with you, both around human capital and other dimensions of natural hazards and climate change that you work on. So thank you so much, Ilan. I'm just going to close with a quick karakia. Piki te kaha, piki te ora, piki te wairua, huye tai kie. Kia ora, tēnā koe.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for listening.